about recording in progress. God, it's like being heckled. The issues of changes in attitudes to language over the languages of Scotland over the last 50 years of the ASLS existence. And we've got a joint session coming up. We have Professor Misha McCloud, personal professor at Aberdeen University, part of the directorate of the Confucius Institute there. She's lecturing in Gaelic since 2004 at Aberdeen, specialises particularly in modern Gaelic literature and much to my great support and delight in Gaelic drama. Her most recent publication has been a wonderful edited collection for the ASLS annual volume at Century of Gaelic Drama, which I have to say, Michelle, I've already cited in a couple of articles. So I really feel up to date. She's also co-director of a major research network involving UHI, Aberdeen, Edinburgh, and Gaelic, the Social Research Network in Gaelic Studies, co-director of that. And Robert McColl Millar, Professor Robert McColl Millar, Professor of Linguistics and Scots Language at Aberdeen, published on the interface between Gaelic and Scots, which makes him particularly appropriate speaker this afternoon, and also language policy towards Scots. He's the current editor of Scottish Language, the ASLS language publication, and a member of a number of steering committees, including the steering committee of the Angus McIntosh Centre for Historical Linguistics at Edinburgh. My old linguistics professor says he, having just once, actually been in a room with them, but there you go, you can still drop the name. Trustee of Scottish Language Dictionaries and past chair of the Forum for Research in the Languages of Scotland and Ulster. His most recent publication of substance was in last year, a social linguistics history of Scotland. So Michelle, I believe, is going to head off. So thank you, Michelle.
Thank you. Thanks, Ian. Thanks, everybody. Let me just share my screen. I'm going to I can't see you all. I think we haven't thoroughly rehearsed delivering this together. But I imagine this will turn out like a conversation that Robert and I quite often used to have in the corridors of Taylor Building at Aberdeen, when such things happened, when we used to bump into each other and chew the fat over issues around Gaelic and Scots. So this is, it is a summary of current status, kind of reflecting, as you said, Ian, in the introduction, how we've arrived at the place that we're currently in with the languages in Scotland, and looking at the demographics of both Gaelic and Scots, who speaks it and where, just briefly talk a little bit about various policy interventions and initiatives to promote and support the languages, consider some of the challenges, and then really asking ourselves in advance of perhaps you asking us what next for Gaelic and Scots in Scotland. Oops, why did it do that? There we go. So just by way of summary introduction, I'm sure most of you will be at least familiar with some of the demographics. We have, according to the 2011 census, there is no 2021 census yet, obviously delayed by the pandemic. I don't expect there to be massive change in the next 10 years, but we wait to see. But we'll have a quick look at some trends to give you an idea of what's happened over the last 10, 20, 50 years or so. So we've got over 57,000 speakers of Gaelic in Scotland and over 87,000 people who claim some kind of understanding of Gaelic language. Now, for the most part, the language planners and the sociolinguists are really mostly interested in the speakers, but there is a lot to be said for looking at those who have a passive knowledge of the language. And there's been some work done considering how you can change these passive language, people of passive language ability into active language speakers. So you can see an interesting change in the demographics and the young speakers, and I'll be returning to speak about that later on, how between 2001 and 2011 we actually have more speakers in the under 24 range than we had 10 years ago. It's not enough to compensate for a decline in the older speakers, but it has slowed down the decline at least. And this is a graphic that, again, perhaps some of you will be familiar with, just showing the rate of decline from just over 100 years ago. The first time a question was asked about Gaelic on the census in 1891, when there were more than 250,000 Gaelic speakers in Scotland, down to the present day. So it just kind of shows that decline. A false surge here. There are reasons for that I won't go into. But one thing that's worth noting that has changed a lot in terms of the community of Gaelic speakers in Scotland in the last 50 years is where speakers are located. So from the census last time, the figures aren't hugely important. I'll talk about them a little bit, but it's about trends. More than 40% of Gaelic speakers are now located outside of what might have been considered traditional Gaelic speaking communities. In Glasgow, for example, Glasgow City, around about 10,000 speakers. So only 1% of Glasgow, but a considerable number of speakers. In the Western Isles, Language, which changed its name from the Western Isles Council to officially a Gaelic name only in the last 10 years or so, we see a decline in speakers, and that is something that is of concern to sociolinguists and to language planners. There's only one parish in the whole of the Western Isles that has a density of speakers of more than 65%. And this decline in density of speakers is very worrying. So what we used to think of as a kind of a lowland-highland divide of where speaker communities or where speakers are located really has changed a lot over the last 20 or so years. And it's something that is very current, and people are quite concerned about talking about where the speakers are and how we support the speakers. So I'll hand over to Robert.
Thank you, Michelle. It's often rather sobering to compare what we know about Gaelic speakers and how many they are and so on when we compare that actually with their knowledge of for Scots and Scots speakers, because this is practically non-existent. There's only ever been one question asked about this in the census of 2011. Briefly, since I know most of you will know this already, essentially it found that there were 1.5 million people who claimed to be speakers of Scots in Scotland. And in some parts of Scotland, according to the materials there, a majority of speakers said they spoke Scots as their native tongue. This was primarily in the northeast of Scotland and also in Shetland. There are some problems. The question itself contrasts and is in some way in conflict with another question which asks, are you a native speaker of English? And almost everybody said yes, but that would actually include some Gaelic speakers as well, many Gaelic speakers in fact now as well. Nevertheless, there is actually a strong likelihood that the figure of 1.5 million is actually quite conservative. And in fact, probably 2 million might be more accurate. Okay, if I could have the next slide, please. That's you, actually. Yeah,
we're going to talk briefly about, both of us will address the issue of what kind of legislation and institutional frameworks are currently in place to support the languages. So I think this is one of the biggest changes that's happened in the last 50 years or so, and certainly in recent history, has been the enactment of the Gaelic Language Scotland Act in 2005. And this gives equal respect to Gaelic in Scotland. It doesn't give it equal status, which is what a lot of people wanted. Some people still think that the Language Act is a little bit weak, but others would say it's not necessarily, the Act itself isn't that weak, but we could make it stronger by using all of its provisions. The main provisions of the Act are to do with the language board that it established, Bord na Gaelic, who have a remit to promote and develop Gaelic, increase number of people using the language, advise Scottish ministers, require public bodies to prepare language plans, and I'll talk about that, and also to write and implement a national Gaelic language plan. So they have a strategy document every 5 years or so, and we're currently just in the third plan. The aims of which are fairly straightforward: increase the use of Gaelic, increase the use of learning, and ensuring a positive image of Gaelic. And I've just finished a piece of research with some colleagues in Edinburgh and UHI on the implementation of the language plan. I can't talk about it too much yet, but by and large, it's been very positive. We see that where the board have been criticised by others, we see actually the implementation of the plan has gone pretty well. One of the other legislative frameworks that language planning is hung around in Scotland now is the Gaelic language plans, the public authority plans. So at the moment, there are 57 public authorities that have been asked to write and implement a language plan. And that language plan has to be fit for purpose, so it will have different requirements according to the public body, according to where they're located, and to their main body of work. So I think an image there, I think people get quite upset about the fact that Police Scotland are required to have a language plan, and a quick look at social media would see a lot of complaints about why have we got POLIS written on the side of a police car, for example. But these public authority language plans are a useful tool. They require various measures. They're also useful for people to understand the use of the language in the public authority area. So I won't say too much more about them at the moment, and I'll hand back to Robert.
Thank you, Michelle. I think when we look at how Scots has been treated, at least over the last century and a half, within the United Kingdom, I think it would be fair to say that it's been treated with benevolent neglect. This is the classic British way to deal with things. It's worth remembering that once you get outside the cities in England, England is monoglot in a way that no other part of the United Kingdom actually is. So from the Westminster point of view, looking after a kin tongue to English may seem as being utterly bizarre, because English isn't protected, so why should Scots, or indeed Gaelic or Welsh, be protected? The other thing that's often fed into Scots, and I sort of hesitate to say this in this particular forum, is the fact that there's been the literary road, which is, as an example of that, I was giving a paper at a conference 15 years ago, and somebody said, oh, we'll be fine as long as we have the literature. Heinz Kloss, very great sociologist of language, said that when we're talking about the use of a language on a day-to-day basis, tax forms are more important than poetry. You know, what language your tax form is matters more from that point of view. And there's been a danger that everything has been shoved off into this literary creative way, when in fact language is that, but it's other things as well. When the new Parliament came into being, and the Scottish Executive, as it was at that time, came into being, the then Labour Liberal Democrat coalition seemed to treat the Scots anyway is something that they didn't particularly want to focus on or have any great interest in. We can see that actually in the responses to the Council of Europe's Charter for Regional or Minority Languages in 2001 and 2006. 2006, particularly if you want to look at the Council of Europe site, is particularly embarrassing because nobody's bothered to proofread it. That's how much they cared about Gaelic as well, to be honest with you. Do you mind, could I have the next slide, please? Thank you. In an essay from 2006, I said, there can be little doubt that what passes for language policy on the part of the United Kingdom and Scottish governmental actors has been poorly assembled and implemented in a half-hearted and contradictory manner. There is certainly little evidence that the Scottish Executive and Scottish Parliament have taken the issue of language policy for Scots seriously. In other words, it was just something they had to do because the United Kingdom government had signed up Scots for certain rights. Now, 2007, of course, comes along. You get a different style of government coming. The SNP, in its various policy documents before coming to power, had always stressed language planning and policy developments for both Gaelic and Scots. It was central to the view of Scotland. So from 2007 on, there were developments in terms of getting a sense of what was needed for the Scots language and what was needed for the speakers of Scots. So here we got something from an audit that was held in 2010. I just want a quick look at a couple of these quotes from the audit. It says, these regional festivals connect the language and its speakers to local heritage, promoting modern Scots language and identities by rooting them in a respected past. Now notice that word heritage, which I'll be getting back to, and the idea of a respected past. The Scottish Government could consider, in partnership with local authorities and Scots language provision organisations, how the profile of Scots language provision at local authority level may be developed and increased. Note the number of modal verbs there. With that, this is very much tentative. Now, I have to immediately declare about this that a combine I was part of, we didn't get the tender for this. So I don't want to sound too bitter about it. But in fact, what it's basically saying, it's a cultural item, it's part of heritage. This is all great, but it's not actually got anything that says this is why we want it to continue into the future. The Curriculum for Excellence, if we can get the next slide, thank you. Curriculum for Excellence, when it first came into being in 2010, these are some of the things that children in Scottish schools were supposed to feel about Scotland's languages. It says, I enjoy in exploring and discussing word patterns and text structures and the richness and diversity of the languages of Scotland. Footnote, the languages of Scotland will include the languages which children and young people bring to the classroom. All fine. I like the idea of the richness and diversity and exploring, enjoying exploring there. And the other one there, I appreciate the richness of language and text. You get the definition of text and the importance they can have in my life. Great. If you have the next slide, please. Okay, you have the Ministerial Working Group on the Scots Language, which was an important one and did give various recommendations. We've got there, talks about the possibility of establishing Scots tunes, dialect conservation areas, sites of special linguistic interest. The Scottish Government response recognises the importance of Scots, which is a good thing to say, in local communities as need to be supported. And then goes on to say that they don't know exactly what they want to do with it, which I think is probably fair enough. Okay, so as you can see there, it's slightly, it's confused and difficult to understand exactly what anybody is trying to do with it, with policy at that point. Sorry, Michelle.
Thanks. So Robert touched on Curriculum for Excellence, so I also wanted to pick up on education as one of the things that has really changed over the last 50 or so years with regard to Gaelic. The very first Gaelic medium primary school opened in 1985, and that was there was one in Glasgow and there was one in Edinburgh. And Gaelic education and Gaelic medium education for sure has been one of the success stories of I suppose Gaelic promotion in terms of attracting student numbers. Now, again, we don't need to know the figures here. They're too small even for me to read unless I peer really closely. But it shows what I wanted to show with this infographic is growth. Growth in primary schools over the last 20 or so years. In 2019-2020, there was 3,700 pupils enrolled in Gaelic medium primary education. And Gaelic medium primary education has really, as you can see, developed, grown, been successful. There's been a lot of research done on the academic attainments of pupils in Gaelic primary schools, and it's always shown that pupils entering Gaelic medium education do really well, not just at acquiring a second language, if they are in fact acquiring a second language, but just in terms of their other attainment in maths and English, whatever, across the board, pupils in Gaelic medium education are shown to be very successful. Where there are problems is the massive drop-off between primary and secondary, that far fewer pupils have access to their education through the medium of Gaelic in secondary. We also have difficulties in terms of measuring actually the linguistic competence of some of the pupils in Gaelic medium education. So whereas we know that they attain, that their attainment in other subjects is really, really good, there's been limited research, and I've done some work on this myself, on the attainment of language expertise in the primary schools. And there are some problems there, which have been addressed, or some of the education authorities are trying to address and strengthen the language skills that the school pupils acquire. But absolutely, the school pupils tend to be very dedicated to the language. Again, some research that I've done previously has shown that the pupils feel very motivated, they take pride, they take ownership of the language in primary school. But what we see, and there's been quite a substantial amount of research done on this, is that children in Gaelic education tend to associate Gaelic with school, and that they don't necessarily use the language outside of school. And that continues. It doesn't just relate to while they're at school. There's been some really good research done recently by Stuart Dunmore, where he has worked with graduates, if you like, or school users, school leavers, from the first cohort of school leavers, so people now in their late 20s, early 30s. And some of the work that he's done with them, he's been asking, how much do you use Gaelic now that you no longer in the education system? And just these two images here, I think, are interesting for us. We see that on the right, first of all, where they converse with another person who has the ability to speak in Gaelic, that they actually mostly use English. We have only a small percentage who would mostly use Gaelic. Only 2 out of the cohort only Gaelic. And then when we have on the left here, some of these school leavers, late 20s, early 30s, are now parents. We asked, Stuart Dunmore asked them, do you use Gaelic with your children? Or what languages do you use with your children? And we see here that it's mostly English. So we're not really seeing strong evidence of the education system creating new speakers, people who habitually speak the language. It gives good education, it gives some competency, it gives the potential and the ability to speak language, but it's not necessarily turning into language speakers. And that is an area of concern.
Okay, when Michelle saw this slide, when I sent it to her earlier on in the week, and she said, are you not missing something there? Now, I'm not wanting to attack the Scottish Government for this at all, but the Scots Language Policy document of 2015 was remarkable more in the fact that they had produced a policy document than actually in what was said in it. It was a 1 page of A4 on one side document. It did say that it was going to push the Scots language, and it did say that eventually there would be some kind of Languages of Scotland Act. But naturally, we have been through a few problems since then, which have nothing to do with language. So it tends to have, you know, just been pushed over and pushed over and pushed over, because it doesn't butter bread, I suppose, in the end up. So if you wouldn't mind, go to the next one. The big thing is, of course, in the last decade has been Scots language and education. The Scottish Government put together in 2015 5 Scots language coordinators who dealt with different regions of the Scots-speaking part of Scotland. This, after about 6 months, was brought down very quickly to one person who's still very much with us, Bruce Johnson, who deals with it and has been very active in this, in pushing it. We've also had, during that time, my own university, or our own university, has started doing Scots courses, not Scots courses about Scots, but Scots courses for people who either speak it or don't speak it. There have been several attempts in secondary schools in particular to develop Scottish studies with a strong Scots language element. Of course, yeah, that's true enough, Maureen. The thing is that everybody is very much aware of what has taken place in Banff Academy, which is remarkable. There's also similar things have been done in Buckie Academy as well. The North East, as you would expect, is at the forefront of this sort of thing, where most children in some schools will be native Scots speakers. Right. But my question, which turns up again and again in this, if I had more time, we could look at what local authorities do. It seems to me that quite often the centre takes the credit for something that was an individual's action, that if it wasn't from, for certain individuals like Jamie Fairbairn, it's difficult to imagine how well this would have gone elsewhere, because it has to be said, my understanding of it from elsewhere is it's often quite perfunctory, this sort of thing. All right, so when it comes to that, there's always a problem with Scots language policy, and in particular about education, which is at the heart of policy, or should be, which is that it tends to be individual groups, individual local authorities, individuals within government who are interested, and when they're in power, they push it forward. Right. Michelle?
5 minutes, folks, 5 minutes.
Thanks.
Okay.
That's right. Doesn't want to move on. Don't know what's going on. Hang on a second. There we go. So we're coming close to the end. I wanted to talk a little bit about challenges. What challenges do we have surrounding Gaelic at the moment? I think some of the biggest challenges are around perceptions of Gaelic speakers, and around the location of communities. Now, some of you, I'm sure, will be aware of, you will have seen the sensationalist media reporting around the publication of the Gaelic Crisis in the Vernacular Community 2020 by CURRICUL et al. From Saoirse. And, you know, the book itself isn't particularly controversial. There are some things in it, but there was a lot of sensational media reporting around the fact that Crahúr's and the book, The Gaelic Crisis, said that the communities are in dire need of support, and that the language is failing as dying out quickly as a language in the community, as a real community language. And I think that that's fairly true, but what the sensationalist reporting did was create a lot of very strong direct criticism of some of the policies that are currently in place to support the language. It also created some kind of tension between the heartland speaker communities and the network speaker communities out with the heartland. And these tensions are not necessarily useful. I mean, we have seen some helpful grassroots interventions, which I think anything at grassroots level is potentially good and necessary. But any kind of friction between our communities is not useful. We've seen a lot of criticism of Borna Gaelic by Audit Scotland in the press over the last couple of years. As I said, some research that I've just been involved in has looked at the implementation of their last plan. And I think that once that is published, hopefully that will allay some of the fears that people have about the effectiveness of some of the planning mechanisms. One of the biggest challenges is about politicisation of the language and perceptions of the language as some kind of Scottish National Party tool to make us all become, to make us different from the rest of the UK, so that we are, that it's an independence, a tool in I suppose, working towards independence, which is absolutely nonsense, because of course the Gaelic Language Act was brought forward by the Labour Liberal coalition a long time ago. It enjoys cross-party support, always has enjoyed cross-party support in both the Scottish Parliament and in Westminster. And it was in fact the Tory government in Westminster way back in the 80s that began supporting Gaelic development through the insertion of big pots of money. So I'll let Robert speak about challenges.
Yeah, I think it's very noteworthy when we compare Scots with Gaelic that Scots does not have anything at all like the Borna Gaelic, good or bad, no matter how it behaves. Activism has always gone through sort of a range of waves. I can remember when I returned to Scotland in the mid-1990s, there was a great deal of criticism of the official and highly established players, the dictionaries, the Scots Language Society, as being sclerotic, as being not particularly interested in speakers of the language, more in writers of the language. This caused the development of what are often referred to as the currents, the cells, which were designed to be, to misquote Mao, to be Scots-speaking activists swimming in a Scots-speaking sea. Whether the people that spoke Scots around them actually saw them as that, I don't know. They went online because they're perfect for online, but they seem to have, basically disappeared largely. Now we have, and it's good to see at the University of Glasgow and surrounding it, is a strong development towards activist activity to do with, again, a legal act on the languages of Scotland, particularly associated with Ur Vice, but there are other people involved with it as well, to try to get activists to work together rather than to spend most of their time attacking each other, which it's been like in the past. The problem is, however, that it's often down, in fact, it's always down to volunteers who have other commitments, and it can get quite difficult to carry on when you don't seem to be getting anywhere. That may have changed, but that's in there. Now, on the next page, I was going to mention some things about what's happening to Scots, because we're talking here about language activism, but we don't actually think about the language and what's actually happening with it. But I don't think we've really got time. That might turn up sometime later. It may just skew things too much. So if we pass on to...
Yeah, I mean, I think we were just going to think about what next for Scots and Gaelic, and this is kind of maybe a preview if anybody's got any questions for us. I think both of us are interested in the proposed Scottish Languages Bill that was in the SNP manifesto. What will that do? What will that look like? And how will it support Gaelic more? How will it change the legislation for Gaelic, and what can it do for Scots language? But I think that we're both excited, speaking, hopefully I'm speaking, not speaking out of turn, Robert, that this might tackle one of the biggest issues that both Gaelic and Scots share, is in terms of perception, and that anything that can be done to encourage people to accept linguistic diversity as something that is part of Scotland's landscape. And we're talking about about Gaelic and Scots, but of course there are more languages in Scotland which also should be recognised in our bigger linguistic landscape. So I think we're very hopeful that if we do get a new Scottish languages bill, that it will promote diversity, and that this kind of a diversity campaign is really needed for the acceptance and the promotion of both Gaelic and Scots. And just, they've got that little picture there, sorry, I should just say will we ever get to that stage? I don't know, I think this is kind of token politics. It's maybe, I'm not sure which council chamber this is from. It's either in Derry or it's somewhere in Belfast, but it's Irish and Ulster Scots there. Will we get to that stage? In fact, do we want to get to that stage?
And actually, just underline that, you see there where I've tendentiously said the blending of Scots and colloquial English there, which is that we're talking here about a situation where if, God forbid, Gaelic stopped having native speakers, Gaelic could still be seen as a separate language. Scots, of course, is a close relative of English. It's always had problems of identification. There's no point in denying that. But there is a strong danger, in fact, I perceive it as happening already, that Scots itself may be ceasing to be a discrete entity and may, for many people, particularly younger people, become a blend of colloquial English and Scots. That's not me saying that people would stop sounding like they came from the northeast of Scotland or wherever, because they would. But it's just the amount of vocabulary would be, there would be strong attrition of it and so on. And this is something that, particularly the activist movement, there is that immediate strong criticism of people who are perhaps approaching the linguistic reality of large parts of Scotland, which they don't like. You know, so there's that danger. To be fair, Urvice isn't like that, but there are other people out there who do feel strongly like that. So it may be that no matter how much respect, no matter how much recognition a language gets, this may not help it in the long run, because in the end up what we need are speakers.
That's very, very helpful. Thank you very much, both of you. We're slightly overrun, but I'd like to leave time for any questions that are pressing. So, Rona.
Sorry, I was just clapping, not raising my hand. I was just showing appreciation. Sorry.
Any questions? Just looking across. Okay.
Derek's got his hand up, have you?
Derek, yes. Derek, go. You're mute, Derek.
Yeah, I'm unmuting now. Can you hear me?
Aye,
yeah.
Fine.
Yes. A couple of points. There's still the political angle, which we've noted. There was the cross-party group, and a couple of years ago, I contacted Alistair Allen with a view to seeing if it could be reconstituted, and he responded that he and others would be very keen on rejoining it, but the Unionist parties see supporting of Scots as an SNP ploy to get them to join the cross-party group. Right now, a couple of weeks ago, this was raised again. Could we reconstitute the cross-party group on Scots? And exactly the same response came up. I've contacted several of the MSPs. All the ones that I contacted, names have been given to me by Alistair Allen, said they would rejoin the cross-party group on Scots if it were reconstituted. But again, the barrier is that for a cross-party group to be cross-party, it needs representatives from all the parties, I think, and the Tories and the Labour and the Lib Dems won't join a cross-party group on Scots because it's too nationalistic, so they think. Now, how do we shake folk out of this ridiculous attitude? This is a fundamental problem. Also, it's still very much, as we mentioned earlier, the case that so much is reliant on individual executives and teachers and who are keen on and knowledgeable about Scots. I think to some extent, I'm sure the same applies to Gaelic. It's just not institutionalized. There just is not the official support for it. I think excuse me, hang on. When the loss of Alistair Allen as the specific post of Minister for the Languages of Scotland was a big blow, because the responsibility for the languages then passed it to John Swinney, who is interested and keen, and a good man, and hard-working, but has just too much else on his desk to give the attention to the promotion of Scots and Gaelic that they need. So with all the activity that's going on in academic circles and and political circles and educational circles, we just have not got the underlying institutional support. And I don't know how. It's having been in the field and been active for 50 years and more, you can see it does get depressing how little progress has been made in some respects, although an awful lot of progress has been made in other respects. There's more attention, there's more writing in Scots.
Okay, Derek, that's really, really important input. And I think what I'd like to suggest, because we're now cutting into Kirstein's time, so we must, out of politeness at least, not do much more. This has been a very, very valuable session. And what I'd like to suggest, following Derek's prompts, that we go to Council of the ASLS, taking on board what Derek has just said, and see what actions, I'm looking at you, David, as President, we can take forward. So can we thank Michelle and Robert for their excellent contributions? Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Moving